Life as Ceremony shares personal stories, interviews with inspirational souls, and practical wisdom to help you reconnect with yourself and spirituality. Welcome back to another episode of Life as Ceremony. Today we have Amanda Carson joining us. She is a registered social worker who specializes in loss, grief, and life transitions. Thank you for joining us today, Amanda.
Thank you for having me.
Before we talk about grief, loss, life transitions, and how to support listeners and maybe people in their
Mhm.
life, I know that you listen to the podcast. Thank you for
Yeah.
listening to it.
Yes, it's
So
been
are
great.
you prepared for a little rapid fire and some this or that questions?
Definitely.
Okay. Ocean or lake?
Initially, I want to say lake.
Is that a
Yeah,
prairie thing or Manitoba
I
thing? Yeah.
I think so. I think so. Like the ocean is what it is, right? Like, but there's something about Manitoba Lake.
Yeah.
Like that's what I know.
Totally. Yes, I love lakes and I'm lucky to live by the ocean now, but I miss lakes. There's something about them. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Um, do you have a favorite season
Fall for sure.
and how come?
It's just perfect, like in the sense of the comfortability of the temperature, um, the beauty, like the colors. I find like for me, I know a lot of people love summer, but when summer comes around, I actually like get kind of like on edge and almost like a little bit like anxious because I almost have this feeling of like having to be on all the time.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
then as we come into fall, there's just this like natural like slowing down that feels um so comforting, but it's also not like as slow as winter.
Hmm.
So it's just this beautiful balance.
Yeah. What's coming to mind for me as well with fall is the season of surrender or loss or
Yeah.
change. So interesting
Okay.
that that's your favorite season and given the line of work that you do. Yeah.
Kidding. Yeah, I never thought of it that way, but I feel like you talked about that recently in the podcast episode. I can't remember who that was with, but
Hmm.
about fall being this like time of
Change.
letting go and yeah,
Mhm. Totally.
surrender.
Coffee or tea?
I laugh only because I'm sitting here with tea. And so for me, like I drink decaf. I've drank only decaf for like 5 years.
Mhm.
So I have like one decaf coffee in the morning and then throughout the whole rest of the day, it's tea. So both, I
Oh,
guess. Like I love the taste of coffee, but the caffeine for me is too much. So I stick to that. But tea throughout the day, like
mhm.
just yeah, definitely one of my like anchoring practices, I would say,
N-
that I come back to.
Dogs or cats?
Okay, I feel like I know what the right answer is. You know what I mean? But I do want to say both. I do personally though feel like this is gonna sound bad, but even with my pets, like I have both, a
Mhm.
dog and cats. But I feel like there's almost like this hierarchy in my mind of like dogs are like more important. Like that sounds weird or I don't know why, but like and cats are almost a little more like, oh, they're cats, like they kind of just exist around us. But they're both I don't know, even today, like I walked into our bedroom and our cat was laying on her bed in the sun, just like this on her back, like completely exposed. And it was just, it's like, how can you not, love
Aw.
that?
Aw. And
Yeah.
can you share your dog's name with us?
Yeah. So his name is Dobie.
And your cat's name. I won't forget about the cat.
Yeah, the kid. Okay. So we have two. So Kushi is our female,
Hmm.
and then we have Pupper, who is our male.
Cushy and Pepper or Pupper?
Pupper.
Pupper.
Yeah.
Okay. And Dobby. And Dobby looks like Richard Gere. Like, have you- Yeah, her dog looks like Richard Gere, but I think like all Shelties look like Richard Gere. Have
I
you
love
seen this
that.
meme?
No.
Really? Okay, Shelties literally look like Richard Gere. It's like this dog meme side by side. I'm gonna send this to you after the episode because
Please do.
I think of this meme every time you post Dobby, and I'm like, it's Richard Gere.
I have never put that together, but please, please do.
I will share it with you.
Amazing.
If you didn't live in Winnipeg, where would you live?
Mm. Mm. Vancouver.
Yeah.
I love Vancouver. I love the West Coast in general. Um, we usually go out in the spring. So I like to call it like my home away from home. I think it's kind of, when I think of Vancouver, I kind of like it's that same feeling that fall gives. Um, like to me, it's just like the perfect balance of everything that I love.
And do you have a favorite book on grief?
Ooh, good question. I I want to say The Wild Edge of Sorrow by
Mhm.
Francis Weller. Um, that one I keep coming back to. I've been reading it again lately. There's so many, but his the way that he speaks is it's beautiful.
He has a few different books on grief, yeah? Or
That's a good question. I know that he does have a few different books. I only have read the one.
okay,
Yeah.
Wild Edge of Sorrow.
Yeah.
And last question for you, last rapid fire question. Do you have any words to live by, or just anything that's even top of mind
Mm,
lately?
yeah. A client shared this with me recently. So I want to say it comes from um, his name is Matt Kahn. I don't actually know much about his work, so I can't say exactly what it is that he does. I believe maybe some kind of coach, but don't quote me on that for sure. But the quote itself is whatever arises, love that.
Hmm.
And it kind of reminds me of like the Rumi poem of like the guest house, like that idea of like whatever comes to the door, invite it in. But honestly, when my client shared that quote with me, I loved it so much that I've been contemplating getting it like as a tattoo. It's like some man's quote, but this whatever arises, love that. Like, can you, yeah, bring love and compassion to whatever is here?
Thank you for sharing that with us. And as you mentioned tattoo, now I'm kind of wondering if you got your Progi tattoo yet.
I was gonna say if I wasn't sure if we talked about that. Okay, no, but it's in the works. Like I already have got some picture ideas of what I mean, it's gonna be a very simple, fine line pierogi.
Yeah.
But soon. Like I'm hoping spring.
And can you share the meaning behind that tattoo with us?
Yeah. So I mean, my family background is Ukrainian, and my dad actually during the full scale invasion has gotten his own tattoo as a way to kind of honor the heritage. But he got the trident. And for me, I just kind of want maybe like a little more of a tattoo that can honor, but also kind of just bring in, yeah, like my love for the food, like the pierogi itself. Like I literally have memories of like being at my grandparents' house when we were younger and like having pierogies as a bedtime snack. Like I'm not even kidding you. So there's a lot of like memories tied into that as well. And yeah,
Beautiful. Well, you'll have to share it with us on
I will.
Instagram or
I
whenever you
will.
get your fine line Progi tattoo. Yeah.
I will for sure.
So, what brought you to where you are today, specifically working with grief, loss, and life transitions?
Yeah, I was thinking about that because, I've been asked that question and I kind of like at this point have almost like a familiarized answer. But honestly, I think even over the last year, I've just been thinking about our experiences of loss and grief, right? So in the past when I've answered this question, I've kind of answered it from the perspective of like when I first started to experience death losses, like in my early adult years. But honestly, at this point now, when I think about even growing up and some of the losses that occurred throughout childhood, right? So this could be like loss of an animal, a pet, maybe a type of grief that is a little less acknowledged in our world. Um, Even just like the things that maybe weren't received. You know what I mean? So for me, I think when I really break it down, I initially was kind of going, okay, in my early adulthood, I was having these experiences of death loss. I started my career in like a long term care, palliative care setting, moved into hospital and was working with patients and clients who were ill and who were passing away on unit, and then into private practice, supporting people with their experiences. But I guess at this point now, when I really think about kind of like taking that step back and looking at bigger picture experiences of loss, I just don't know that there's really like anything more like human, to be alive and to experience many different forms of like attachment and then losing of things. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying like some of these early experiences shaped that path. But when I look back now, I really just recognize like how interwoven all of our experiences are. And for me at this point, it just really feels like such important work because of how human it is to experience loss and
Hmm.
just the reality that that's something we all will experience and continue to experience.
Hmm. Was there any particular loss that struck you in such a way that you really turned towards this work?
Mhm. Yeah, so there definitely was. And I kind of, yeah, relate to coming into adulthood, having lost three friends suddenly and unexpectedly. And as that was happening, I remember having a lot of like anxiety around those experiences, which in itself is maybe a topic that's less spoken about, like how anxiety is certainly a part of loss and grief, right? Sometimes we think about grief as like, okay, the five stages. Where does anxiety fit into that? So, in those early experiences, I was noticing a lot of anxiety. And that's actually what brought me to yoga as well. Um, but then in my early career within the hospital setting, we had a sudden and unexpected loss of a patient, and it had like such a profound effect on me that yeah, like not at all what I would have expected. And I just knew that support was needed, and was really working through that in my own way. And through that, just really came to see how like I want to bring more of a voice to this. Because I think even within the hospital setting, like supports provided, there's kind of this like initial debriefing that can happen, um, but then kind of on your own, like work continues, life continues. And so I just realized like the importance of having spaces where we can explore these really like life shifting experiences, and just how important that is to have.
Mhm. And as a human, not necessarily a therapist, when you
Mhm.
experience those death losses in your early 20s, what was one of the first things you turned towards for support? Was it a book,
Mm.
a therapist? Yeah.
That's a good question. You know what? The first, like the answer that comes to mind for me for that is honestly, I'm like, I don't think like the most maybe like healthy, strategies. So for example, like when I think back to that time, I've talked about this recently on social media, just how I remember when those losses happened. I'm not quite sure why, but I remember um, like really finding this value in like staying strong. and I'm not sure why exactly or where that came from. But I remember kind of, yeah, leaning into that role of being strong, making sure others were okay. Almost like, it sounds weird to say, but even almost like priding myself in how I was like able to handle it. And, but meanwhile, like I was having,
Mhm.
right, these like lingering effects. Um, so, so yeah, I don't really think like there just certainly wasn't at that time, like I hadn't started any kind of therapy while that was happening. So there wasn't anything like that. I hadn't really even like fully gone into the path of like my own schooling yet. So, in terms of even like reading or books or anything like that, it was almost, I think, just this like, okay, like this happened, but we have to be strong. We have to move through it. So there wasn't a lot of initial support.
Mhm.
Yeah.
At what point on your journey did you find a support or that moment
Mhm.
that maybe clicked for you? That,
Mhm.
yeah.
I would say it honestly may have only really come after the loss that I experienced within my workplace. Because then I did start to seek more therapeutic support and kind of just learn more about grief and trauma and the impacts of that. So that would have really, I mean, it's like it's been like a span of like 10 years later, like a
Mhm.
long time.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and how interesting that, personal life and professional life, and it kind of
Mhm.
ended up merging in that way. And you maybe didn't know that at the time, a decade ago, and then it took that loss at your workplace and things almost started to like kind of converge or come together in that way. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And even as we're talking about this, like I don't think I've really even, yeah, kind of recognized like just how much time was in between that. And
Hmm.
it just kind of again even has me curious about like some of the clients that I work with too, right? And just like our, yeah, our perspectives on grief, right? And loss and what that looks like and how we move forward or move on or whatever you want to call it, right?
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. What is grief?
Hmm. Um, there are a few definitions that I've been like tossing around lately, because depending on who you ask, maybe you'll get a bit of a different answer. Like in simplest forms, I would say it's a response to loss of any kind. So that can be an emotional response, but that can certainly be, a physical response, a spiritual response. Um, David Kessler, if you're familiar or if listeners are familiar, he says that grief is a loss that we didn't want, we didn't ask for, um, which I agree. But then at the same time, grief can come even in decisions that we've made. So
Oh, yeah.
it's complex for sure.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Interesting. Thanks for sharing, different definitions with us. I am familiar with David Kessler. That idea of losing something that we didn't want to lose. Um, yeah, I think in some contexts it resonates. But then in others, I think of like a relationship that ends and we know needs to end and we choose to end it. And it doesn't negate the grief that we feel, even though we did want that or a part of us wanted that because we knew we needed to
Absolutely.
leave, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
no,
Great.
I agree.
What do you think society gets wrong about grief and loss? Or like a myth, you
Hmm.
want to bust.
Yeah, busting some myths today. Um, hmm. I mean, this is where I really love listening to Francis Weller speak, because he really goes into a lot of detail around just how our world um, doesn't make space for grief and loss, right? And honestly, I do think that that is really true. I think of about even just my own experience, like right now, today, and grief that's been here for myself, or having conversations with friends and clients, and um, so much of our world is about like moving forward and doing more and growing and evolving, and all of that has a place for sure. Um, but sometimes I wonder, like, where does that leave grief then? Our experience of grief, does it leave any time or space for that to truly exist? And then also, like, how do we actually, like, on a really practical level, balance that? Like, that's honestly a question that I've been asking myself lately, is like, how do I, show up in the role that I'm in as a therapist, a friend, a spouse, like, an aunt, any of these things, while also tending to grief.
Mhm.
So I think just this, yeah, the kind of wider perspective of like always bettering and growing. Um, does that actually allow for like things to actually like fall apart, and for things to be lost, and things to no longer exist, and often outside of our control?
Mhm.
Like it's right, it's such a total shift away from like how we like to kind of remain in control, right, at
Mhm.
all times, and yeah.
Yeah, what comes to mind for me as you share that is just, capitalism, the society we live in,
Mm,
that,
yeah.
more, 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 better, 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 faster, faster, faster. And if those are the values that not only like we might take on, but they're just, it's what we're exposed to from such a young age, given the way in which our world seems to be moving. And we kind of have to really unlearn that and come back to the rhythms of nature, which I believe the rhythms of nature allow more space for things to fall apart or allow space for grief. But yeah, the rhythm of capitalism, that where all of a sudden, if things do fall apart, where is that space to grieve? And we feel as though, almost like there's something wrong with us, or that we have to process it faster, when grief, any emotion doesn't work that way. You're not in control of the time in which it takes you to become ready and feel safe and supported to process something. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, and that may be pressure then that, like you said, we can end up putting on ourselves, right? To do it right, to do it um, the right way. That can really take us down like a whole other, that comes up a lot actually with clients, even just around like, how do I do this? Am I doing this right? Am I giving myself space? Am I not? Like, there's just, yeah, there's a lot of, I think, naturally questions around it, because maybe these aren't conversations that we're having like in a wider scale with one another. Like, I often laugh with clients, like, it's not, maybe in like our world we would do this with friends, but like I don't know that most folks just like show up at a dinner party and then like start talking about like existential dread and impermanence and things like that.
I want to go to that dinner party though. Can we start a club? Can we FaceTime me in? I want to go to that dinner party. Yeah.
Definitely.
Can I share what I think, one thing I think society gets wrong about grief and loss? And I want like your opinion on it, or to hear, like, you are the grief and loss expert and specialist. So I want to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah.
It's the idea that there's an end point to
Mhm.
processing it. Because and I'm okay with like being wrong, or if you have a different opinion, but I guess where I currently stand with it is that there's no end point to grief. Like it comes in waves. And I think that grief really shows us the amount of love that was there, and we're never going to stop. For example, in a death loss, like, we're never going to stop loving that person, so we're never going to stop grieving that person. So when we bump into grief, it feels just as intense. And I think sometimes there is this myth out there that grief is this emotion that you process and then you're complete with it. And I'm like, I
Mhm.
don't know if you're ever complete with it.
No, agreed, agreed. I mean, so David, like, he talks a lot about this, and bless his heart, he always, I don't know if you've heard him say this, but he's always like, Elizabeth didn't want the 5 stages to give people this illusion that like you're going to move through them and then you're done. But somehow, right, like the world kind of clinged on to that and was like, okay, so we're going to move through these 5 stages and then we're complete. Yeah, we've checked the grief processing checklist.
Yeah.
Um, where, in reality, like you're saying, absolutely. And especially when it's a death loss with someone that you've loved and cared about. I mean, that's why I really love the continuing bonds theory, which looks at the idea that when someone dies, yes, the physical relationship has ended, but the relationship has not ended. There's still a connection, there's still a bond there, and that it's very natural and normal to want to continue um, that connection.
Mhm.
And in that way, right, it does speak to this ongoing relationship and process. I think for me, when I think about, does it have this like tidy end point or does it come to an end? um Maybe some types of loss that could happen, right? Like for example, say maybe a job, we change a job and there's grief, and then maybe one day we come to acceptance and there's no more grief, maybe.
Mhm.
um but especially when it's been death loss and there's complexity around it, um it will ebb and flow
Mhm.
always, right? And there will be seasons and there will be reminders and there will be periods of time where it feels bigger and then it feels more manageable again. And I think even just that, right? Like what I was kind of speaking to earlier about just the world we live in and this idea of like growth and always doing more and better. I don't know how like that fits in with that, right? Like if there's always going to be this like ebbing and flowing, how are we supposed to be on? How are we supposed to be like
Mhm.
working and improving if like the natural rhythms of being a human is actually like this.
Totally. Yeah. And for listeners who are not watching the video,
Mhm.
Amanda was moving her hand in a wave
Yeah,
to
yeah,
describe more of the ebb and flow of the human experience and not
yeah,
a
and that.
linear upwards graph.
Mhm.
The theory you mentioned, continuing bonds, is that what it's called?
Yeah,
I'm so curious, how do you support clients, or what would be an example of continuing a bond or nurturing or nourishing a relationship with someone that has passed? What would they do? What would a client do? What would we do?
yeah. I mean, it's really it's beautiful sometimes to even just hear what clients bring to session in terms of what that means to them or looks like to them. So that could be anything from clients have shared, maybe they each morning light a candle for their loved one who has passed. And that has become a ritual in its own way that when they light that candle, they say good morning, they say hello to their loved one, and it keeps that relationship ongoing. Um, I've heard of people, continuing to wear jewelry from a loved one, and that is a symbolism of that connection. Even something as simple as talking out loud to the person, you know, um, asking for guidance or sharing something from the day. So the nice thing is, if clients are open to this concept, which a lot of the clients that I've worked with, there is, of course, some relationships are complex, and so, I mean, that's a whole other, we could go down that road as well in terms of like when there is a loss and the relationship was not a good one, right? Then what happens? Um, but most people do want that. So if that's wanted and desired, you know, we can be creative in what that means to us and what's important to us. And honestly, like for me, even like the pierogi tattoo, like that's sort of one way, right? Like I know when I look at that tattoo, like I'll think about my grandparents, I'll think about like the time that I spent with them, the fact that they made us a pierogi dinner for bedtime snack, and just laugh. Mhm.
Thank you for sharing those examples, like the lighting of the candle, the wearing
Mhm.
jewelry, or,
Mhm.
even a tattoo. To me,
Yeah.
what you're really speaking to is ceremony. Even a tattoo can be very ceremonial in that way. And, listeners on the podcast, or if you're new here, I really believe that ceremony is what brings us into a state of presence and connection. So when you talk about, lighting that candle, it's bringing you into a state of presence and connection with that relationship. Or even, getting some, the way in ritual or ceremony, the way people put on their jewelry in the morning or even their makeup. But when you use that jewelry example and thinking of ceremony, how it brings us into that state of presence and connection. And, we can wear it all day and stay in connection, with that person who that jewelry symbolizes. Yeah. Yeah. What is the most helpful thing someone can say to someone in their life who's experiencing grief and loss?
Mm.
Or I guess, and the most unhelpful thing someone could say?
Mhm. Um, this one, I always kind of go, back and forth in my head on this one. I think for sure there are some clear, like, at least from my perspective, like, let's not say that. For example, like anything that comes after, like, at least. Um, so one example that comes to mind with that is I can't remember. I was listening to, I believe, another podcast around when all the fires were happening in LA. And there was a lot of conversation about the at least, like, at least your family's okay, at least no one was hurt, kind of thing. But if we think about losing your home and the impact that that could actually have on you, if you think about everything that exists within your home, um, just even that being a space of like safety and connection. So I think anything that comes after at least, probably want to avoid that because we don't know what means what to someone. Um, that one is a big one that stands out for me. I think in terms of what we could say or what we could offer, I talk about this a lot, like even in the trainings that I'll be doing coming up this year. And I know maybe I talked about this a couple years ago too. I think it's also about the presence that we can bring. So I think a lot of the time there is almost this kind of fear around, like, what do we say? And I think this is where it gets tricky because I think a lot of the time, um, people, I hear from clients that they want to be asked more about their loss. They want to talk about it more. They want to share about it more. Um, but they maybe don't want to bring it up. And I think also it's not, I truthfully believe that it's not that people don't want to know or don't care to ask, but I do think that people feel uncomfortable and don't know what to say.
Totally.
So, so if possible, even starting from that place of just maybe recognizing, like, is there discomfort in yourself as you go to approach someone who's grieving a loss? Yeah, is there discomfort coming up? And if so, can you sit with that? And can you even just simply be present with someone in their loss? Even right, not even so much worrying about what you're going to say, but just being there to listen. And even sharing that, I suppose, around I am here, I'm here to listen.
Mhm.
Um, and I think as well, whether it's in early days or weeks, months, years later, asking, checking in, bringing up again, if it's a death loss, if someone loses another person in their life, bringing that up, asking about the person, sharing memories. Because I think we all enjoy that. Like when I hear stories about, even just recently, I went to visit my aunt and she was sharing some stories with me about my grandma that I never knew. And so it offers me an opportunity to get to know her differently, and in a new way
Mhm.
when maybe I wouldn't have before.
Yeah. This is so in alignment with a conversation I was having with a good friend the other day. Her name is Nikki, and yeah,
Mm.
she's been through, lots of grief and loss, and she shared that with me of, the most helpful someone thing someone can do is, be present or ask about it. Like, and I think what you just shared really resonated with me. It's not that people don't care or don't want to ask, it's that they don't know what to say. And so if you don't know what to say, turn towards that discomfort within yourself so that you start connecting with your friends or asking them or moving through that fear so that you're not afraid to bring it up because the most helpful thing you could do is bring it up, is talk about it, is ask not only how they're doing, but about if it's, a death loss, about that person they lost. If they want to share any stories or memories or anything at all. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I think, that shows up even in like the therapy space too, right? Like just around as therapists, I think we can get in this place of like, am I asking the right questions? Am I giving enough space? Am I helping? Or maybe in grief too, I think I've heard this from colleagues like that wanting to fix it and just all of that. Like I think if we can turn towards those parts of ourselves first,
Hmm.
um, and then approach the situation, we can usually do that with a little bit more, yeah, presence and just compassion for ourselves and the other person.
Yeah. I have a question for you about the at least. Uh,
Yeah.
well, first of all, that was so helpful to hear. Like just for myself, for listeners, if you're ever, in a situation and you're listening, catch yourself if that is a word coming up because it can feel so invalidating to someone who has just lost something. But my question for you is, do clients ever do that to themselves?
Hmm.
Explaining what they're going through and then, oh, but at least this. And how do you navigate that as a therapist?
Mhm. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Clients, I will see that in clients. And for me, I mean, I do practice from a parts perspective. So I will, if I hear that, it's usually a good indicator that there's a part of a client who is maybe trying to manage the experience, right? Maybe move them away from the pain of the grief. Um, and you know what? I mean, when it comes to different parts in the system, it's not necessarily wrong that that's happening, right? Like that may be helping the client in that moment if it's too painful to go towards the grief. But bringing that to the client's attention and exploring it together. And if we're able to, yeah, seeing if that part can maybe open up some space
Mhm.
inside for the grief. And often, I think there's fears around if we go towards this, it's going to take over, it's going to be too overwhelming, too painful. Um, on a really practical level too, I think sometimes it's the I have to continue showing up. I have this role. I have this to do, right? Like it's I think it can feel like a bit of a balancing act for people. So those kinds of, just brushing it off or kind of, yeah, tucking it under the rug, so to speak, for a while. I mean, of course, I can see why people would do that, but yeah,
Mhm.
encouraging some exploration of it.
Mhm. Nice. Yeah, and I think from a parts perspective, exploring, that's a really gentle way to explore it
Mhm.
without, oh, okay, it's just, a part of me who said that or feels that way, and that's why they might be doing it. Yeah, it's a very curious but very compassionate approach to exploring that, I think. Yeah. From my conversation I was having with my friend Nikki the other day, she asked what I thought was a really good question, and I wanted to ask you today.
Hey.
How does grief from trauma show up differently than grief from loss?
I mean, I kind of see um like some interconnections there between both for sure. Um and I think one thing that I've pulled from brain spotting is this idea of the uncertainty principle and also what's called like the non-assumption um, perspective. So meaning, we can maybe hear or read in a book like this is what, yeah, like grief from trauma may look like, or this is what grief from death loss may look like. but really getting curious about like what's right in front of you, with your client. I think though, when there is grief that follows trauma, it can get complex because it's often a disenfranchised grief, meaning that it's not as like socially accepted or recognized. So, for example, if there's a death loss, we're more likely to um, acknowledge that, right? Like there could be a service. We might, yeah, bring someone food after a death loss, spend more time with them in like those initial days. But when there's maybe been a trauma, again, it can have us more isolated. And so there's a complexity around that. And we know as well that with trauma, I mean, it's overwhelming the system, right? And it's leaving us in a place where things are not fully processed. We could be in that state of like hypo vigilance, right? Or hypo and hyper arousal. And so to be in that kind of state and then also trying to connect with our grief, like it may be too much at the time. And so we may need to um, first work with the system and processing the events of the trauma in order to have that connection with the grief. But what I want to say about that too is I don't necessarily think it's just like this like neat and tidy, like we process the trauma, we process the grief. Because again, like I don't see it that way in the work that I do with clients. But I think it's Frank Anderson. He says this in a way that really stands out to me. So, what does he say? He always says, like, trauma blocks love and connection, love and connection heals trauma. So, I think if we're thinking about, right, grief following trauma, there needs to be that access to um, that, like, kind of loving presence inside and that compassionate witness to go towards the grief experience itself and to be with those emotions.
Mhm.
Whereas maybe in a death loss, there could certainly still be some traumatic effects. But if not, the person may um, be able to start to hold space for their grief. I don't want to say like in an easier way, but maybe in a more accessible way and in a way that is not going to be as overwhelming to their system.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think one of my big takeaways, the word was isolation. I
Yeah.
think trauma in general can feel so, bring us into such a state of isolation. And then coupled with grief, and trauma and grief being, what heals it is that love and connection when that might not feel possible in that moment, which then further draws in that isolation. So I think that differentiation, did I say that correctly? Because you gave us such a great example of, that death loss and maybe more socially acceptable in the sense of like there's a ceremony around it. People know about it. People bring food or show up or check in. And yeah, there's definitely more complexity when grief and trauma or when there's grief from trauma. Yeah. Yeah. Um, is there a specific therapy modality you believe is most helpful for processing grief? Or what modalities do you turn to the most in your practice?
I don't know if this is right, but my personal belief is that I don't think that therapists need to necessarily kind of like toss out their toolkit and like, find like a specific thing. I think if we think about, even for example, if we're looking at some of the grief theories, so for example, continuing bonds or even dual process model. With dual process model, what we're looking at is how it's natural for us to have an oscillation between focusing on the loss itself and then also like what they call restoration. So that could be like the stress of the loss, but also the stress of life now and what moving forward looks like. Um, but I think, therapists can get curious about maybe as they understand some more of these theories and models, like what already exists within their toolkit that they could bring to that person. Um, with that being said, though, I mean, for me, because grief is such a full person experience, we know it impacts the nervous system, the body, the mind, our emotions, our spiritual selves, all of that. I like to, if clients are open to it, bring in some polyvagal theory so clients can have a greater understanding of the impacts of the stress of grief on their system. Maybe get a greater understanding of where they're in their own state, ways to support themselves in that. Um, Again, I pull from a parts perspective. So it is interesting to see with that dual process model. And even as we were talking about earlier, the like at least comment, sometimes what we'll see with clients is like clusters. So one of my teachers, he refers to it as these different clusters of parts. So we could have parts that are in a grieving cluster that are missing someone, yearning for someone, longing for someone. There's all the sadness there in that cluster. And then in the restoration cluster, you might see people um, yeah, kind of like, maybe diminishing it, like at least, using those kinds of comments towards themselves, or staying really busy, or taking care of everybody else around them. Or so once we can start to sort of get a sense of just how all of these different parts are working within someone's system, we can, of course, like appreciate all of that, and also, again, see if we can open up some room and space to be with and tend to the grief. And then I also pull from brain spotting. And the reason that I like brain spotting with grief processing is that it does allow for more of that connection to what's going on, like on that deeper emotional level, and brain and body level. And so it's less of a talk therapy, but more of a somatic processing approach. So depending on, again, the practitioner and the way they like to work, I think they can get curious about how they might like to support clients, and maybe moving through some of these different stages, but not like in the like, 5 stages way, but the different phases of where someone's at. But I think if we can, yeah, making maybe a conscious effort around like the whole person experience. So nervous system, mind, body, emotions, spirit, if that resonates with a client or with a therapist's approach. And if not, there's lots of, that can exist outside of therapy too,
Mhm.
right? There's different ways that we can access that support that aren't only within the therapy space.
Mhm. Yeah. And you're reminding me that there's so many different grief models and so many modalities of therapy. So
Totally.
even within and I took for listeners, I took Amanda's grief training a couple years ago and it's amazing. And I'm thinking back to, the PowerPoint that you shared with us. I'm thinking about all the different types of grief, but also the different models of grief that you share because there is no one way, the right way. And on top of models for supporting with grief, there's also modalities of therapy like brain spotting and this more somatic approach. And yeah, I wanted to ask you about some somatic approach or just anything kind of body based because we know emotions live in the body and grief is an emotion. Um, what do you notice in your own life in your own body, but also within your practice of how grief manifests in the physical body?
Yeah, I've honestly heard like such a wide range of things from clients. Anything from skin issues, like developing like acne that they've never had, to digestive upset, to aches, pains, tension, to like GI issues. I know for me, what year are we in now? 2025. So at the end of 2023, I had a old colleague and friend pass away. So she had only she had had a cancer diagnosis that she received earlier in that year. I want to say from the time of getting that diagnosis to the time that she passed away, it was maybe 8 or 9 months. So it was fairly quick. And I remember after she passed away, I like developed this like really intense pain in like my abdomen and stomach, and like a lot of like burning sensation. So even that kind of like inflammatory response. Um, I think that, yeah, when we're kind of looking at, like you said, how emotions live in the body and how the system can go into this kind of like defensive, protective state, targeting the body in some way, like whether that's informal therapeutic work or maybe that's even through like body work, like massage or movement or yoga, or even honestly simply walking, breathing, right? Like kind of tending to ourselves on those levels as well. um, it all really has a place because, yeah, we know the body stores the experience itself. And I think one of the reasons that I really like being able to work like in more of that somatic way is because we don't necessarily have to know or have all the answers or like even put together all the pieces. We kind of can tap into that and provide the safe container for processing and then kind of get out of the way and let the brain and the body do what it knows how to do. So it's a little more of an intuitive, it's definitely like a bit of a surrendering approach. But it certainly has a place in I believe in grief work just because again of kind of the I kind of usually what do I say? I kind of say grief is like it has its own life force. So it kind of does what it wants to do. And so in this way, if the therapy can kind of also meet that, I think that it serves a purpose for sure.
Thank you for sharing that. I think I love that idea that grief, kind of has its own life force. And I think that the idea of us, getting out of the way, this idea of like create the safety, create the support, create the container, and the rest will unfold,
Yeah.
and I think our mind wants to, fix, solve, and control and keep us safe and all the things. And so we often, try to think our way through something versus like focus on the safety and support and then just surrender to the rest. It will unfold. Yeah. Yeah. And you said something that really resonated with me. Like the body and the brain know what to do. They totally know what to do. And I think that we also need to trust that in, yeah, finding that safety and then also trusting, hey, my body, my brain intuitively know what to do here. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is, I think it again, it just ties in so well with just that aliveness that grief has, because sometimes we think about grief as like sadness,
Hmm.
or like depression or these kind of like lower mood type experience when really like it can be anxiety, it can be anger, it can be rage, like it's going to take its own form.
Hmm.
So allowing for that in that container.
Yeah. Beautiful. Um, you shared something on Instagram recently that I wanted to
Mm,
ask you about.
yeah.
You said, "Hey, therapists, I've been reflecting on the grief we experience in a therapeutic relationship, a natural and common part of our work, yet one that's rarely talked about. What do you mean by this?"
Mhm. Yeah. I just I'm seeing it in myself, in my own work, and wanted to bring this to therapists because I think within the work that we do, it's natural that there's going to be change, there's going to be loss, even when there's growth in a client, right? And we see, again, like we were just talking earlier before we started, for example, like if a client decides, like, hey, I don't really know if I need to keep coming to therapy, and then they no longer come to therapy. I mean, obviously that's a great thing. And also, I mean, we form relationships with our clients, with our people. So when we're no longer seeing someone anymore, there is naturally a change there. There's naturally a loss there. And I think sometimes what can happen is we just get into this kind of like we were talking about earlier, just the continuing on with the things, continuing on with our work, continuing on with our day. But do we actually kind of stop and check in with what's happening around some of the change and loss that we experience within our clients? Um, Even if, say, a client that we're working with is struggling, right? And we feel that we see that change, and maybe there's almost like an ambiguous loss that can happen where someone is like still physically present, but on like maybe more of that like psychological level, they're changed, they're different, they're struggling, they're not in a good place. There's grief there. Um, yeah, if therapists have ever had an experience where a client has passed away for any reason, whether it was an illness or something unexpected, or even something like a suicide, like there is obviously grief there. And again, I think, we were talking about this too, the work that we do as therapists, it is often in some of that isolation. And so, of course, we have access to things like supervision and consultation, but yeah, are these conversations coming up in those settings? Or are we also taking the time to explore that within ourselves or within the relationships we have with our colleagues? And honestly, like, I mean, I've been in private practice. This will be the 6th year. If I think about the conversations that I've had with colleagues, I don't think I can remember having a conversation around grieving as therapist, like once,
Yeah.
but yet it's happening for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, it's happening and it's happening all the time in different ways. And, I feel, seen and heard just chatting about this with you right now. Therapy is this relationship-based work. You form relationships with people when they, move on or even unexpectedly don't come back, like, or even if they take a break from therapy and we don't know if or when they're returning, it's that we wonder about them. We wonder,
Totally.
like, if, yeah, if clients out there listening, we wonder about you. We wonder if you're still making sourdough and how it's going and what relationship you're in. And we saw this thing on the street that reminded us of you because we're humans too. And now that I'm talking out loud and like naming those examples, I feel a little bit of like embarrassment or shame. And I don't know if this is like a real thing, but it's like we can't like it's almost like is that in an inappropriate connection with a client? And I personally don't think it is. I think it's a human connection with a client and it's not an inappropriate connection. It's a function of relationship-based work and caring, human to human caring
Yeah.
about someone. And yeah, yeah. And can I say one more thing? Sorry.
Of
We
course, you
really
can.
needed to talk about this. This is why I brought
Yeah.
Amanda on the podcast.
Keep
No,
on, go.
um, you said something that inspired this thought, and it was, oh, like, if we lose, like, there's a death loss of a client, even bound by confidentiality in comparison to a death loss of a friend or family member, where a friend or family member, we might choose to publicly share that grief, a photo, a memory, a story, or something like that. And, there's no right or wrong to share or not share. I think that it's such a sacred experience and it's all about timing and personal choice. But, if someone is following their truth and they share something and that can bring someone a lot of healing and being witnessed in that. And in the therapeutic relationship, if there's a death loss of someone because we're bound by confidentiality, like even I'm told in school, like you can't go to the funeral. You can't go to the
Right.
funeral because how do you know how do you know the deceased? You can't share anything about that on Instagram. Ethically, you can't or shouldn't be sharing with your friends or family members. So you are limited to your supervision or peer consultation to talk about that loss. Like there's restrictions and limitations around how you grieve, which is sad in a way. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think even like what you were just saying there earlier too, right? About the like I almost feel kind of like embarrassed that I'm saying like I think that just goes to speak to how as therapists, like you're saying, right? Like we're told this in school, we're told this by our regulatory bodies, what's allowed, what's not allowed, what's professional, what's not, what's within these boundaries. Um, so it makes that kind of grief again. It makes it a more disenfranchised grief. I think it adds that level of complexity, um, which like creates its own hosts of like problems. I think within like yeah, because if a client dies and then we are feeling like we have no one to share it with and no way to kind of um like where do we go with that, maybe we can go to supervision or consultation, but it can certainly be a lonely experience. And so I mean, I think I don't know, I would like to continue to have these conversations with therapists this year and just kind of look at what is possible like in terms of support around this, but also um, maybe identifying the ways that we like even if we can't bring that to someone else, how are we going to grieve that loss for ourselves, right? Are we going to like are we going to actually give ourselves that time and space, and then what would that look like?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, totally. Well, I hope you continue to bring this up, and I will too. And
Yeah.
important conversations to have, that's for sure. Yeah. My last couple questions for you. How does grief work help or allow people to reconnect with themselves or spirituality? If you do see a connection between those two
Mhm.
things. Yeah.
Mhm. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. As you asked that, the first thing that popped into my head was like, I think in 2023, a couple of years ago, we were driving up to Canmore, and it was a griefy season for me at the time, and I can't quite remember exactly what was going on. But I remember driving up to the mountains and just I don't know. I feel like a lot of us have this feeling driving up to the mountains. Like it's this feeling of like awe of just like it's such a force that you're I don't know. When I drive up to the mountains, it's like this mix of feeling both like intimidated and also just like in complete awe. Um but being in nature in that way, and we've talked about this a bit throughout, um what nature provides, right? And the natural rhythms of nature. And, there was just like a groundedness and like a sense of connection in that moment, where it's almost like, for example, maybe um, the mountain and like the strength that it possesses and the sturdiness that it possesses also can exist within me. And maybe if that's true, then maybe I can meet this experience of grief, um, and loss from that place, or for example, if we think about doing our grief work and really coming to this place of acceptance around impermanence and the changing nature of all things, I think it can also lead us back to really prioritizing like what is most important. I know that for me, that has certainly been the case. Like there's not a day that it sounds so morbid, but like I mean at this point, I don't all day every day think about death, but I mean like I think about it every day. You know what I mean? And like it just it guides me back to how I want to actually live, right? And what am I valuing here now with the time that I have? And I think as I was saying earlier, with having experiences of losing people in my life at a young age, I mean, like I didn't go looking for this lesson. Here it is, and how can I not now live from that lesson? You know.
Beautifully said. And you're reminding me of a quote, and I think it's actually a book title by Pema Chodron, which is "How we live is how we die." Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Thanks you for sharing that with us. And just the way you described nature, connecting with nature, and almost like allowing that to be a metaphor to face experiences, how the interconnectedness between life, grief, and spirituality was really beautifully said. Yeah. What role does spirituality play in your life, personally or professionally?
Yeah. I mean, when I think about spirituality, what comes to mind for me is nature and the natural world. Like even as I'm sitting here right now and I'm like looking out the window, like I can see the sky, I can see the trees. Um, and it's just a presence, you know. I've shared this a few times on Instagram, but just this idea of like looking up at the sky, whether listeners do this or I don't know if you do this, like just literally as you're going about your day, stop and look up at the sky. I mean, it sounds like such a simple um thing, you know, and maybe kind of like a hippie thing, like just look up at the sky. But really, I think it's like this remembering that I don't know. I don't even know what it is. Like, I can't even really put words to it. It's some kind of remembering. Um, and even earlier today, like a client and I, we went for kind of like a walk and talk therapy session. And like just we walked and then we sat on a bench in the sun. And like I just believe in that, connection so strongly to support us. And I think whether we're even really being like consciously aware of it or not, it's there.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, if we're open to kind of leaning into that, it can be that source of support that's just a constant.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I
Mhm.
absolutely look up at the sky and feel such a similar way. I think when you described it as a remembering, I fill in that blank with so many things, whether
Mhm.
it's like a remembering of who we are, a remembering of
Yeah.
our interconnectedness. Like we're all looking at the same stars and the same moon and the same sky and the same sun every single day, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and when you talk about like if there's this openness to lean into spirituality, it can be a constant and it can be a form of support. Just that word constant really spoke to me because what I believe to be true about spirituality and talk about or share on this podcast is that there is no striving for spirituality. It is about presence. It is about here and now. It's about um like the air we all share that we are breathing right now together. Again, sharing that same sky, this yeah, it's this interconnectedness and wholeness that we don't need to search for or strive for. Like that connection and sense of support, that constant, it's right here, right now, available to you in this moment. Yeah, yeah. Um, how can listeners connect with you, work with you? What can we share with them? Yeah.
Good question. So this year, like I mentioned earlier, I've been kind of pulled towards like working with therapists more, supporting therapists. So myself and four colleagues have created in total five trainings for therapists specifically in this work. So if they're curious about that, that's a nice way to just dive into some more exploration, gain some knowledge, gain some skills, but also have an opportunity to explore their own experiences too. And then in terms of, yeah, working together one on one, people can connect on Instagram or through website and reach out if they're looking for maybe that more integrative approach to the work.
Amazing. I will share links in the show notes for listeners, and I believe we have lots of listeners who are therapists. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm really excited about your grief trainings, and yeah, I think also therapists, we need trainings and support, and I love that you're leaning into that work and feeling really called to it. And
Mhm.
I think that, yeah, you are such a perfect fit for that. And I'm happy
Thank
that
you.
you're saying yes to that invitation because I think that as a therapist, we're out there we're looking for that. So thank you for bringing that to us. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on Life is Ceremony. Thanks for being here, Amanda.
Thank you.